I never learned her name the first year she worked our base. That is the shame I carry, and I will put it at the front where it belongs, because a man ought to name his own failure before he tells you anything else. For 11 months I called her the laundry girl. So did everyone at Camp Harrow Point. She had a name stitched on her own coveralls in thread the color of dust, and I walked past it 100 times a week and never once bent close enough to read it. Harrow Point sat inland in country the maps called High Desert and the men called the Anvil. Wind came off the flats in the afternoon like something opening an oven, and it carried grit into every seam of every machine we owned. We were a fuel and ordnance garrison, which is a plain way of saying we sat on more things that burn than any sane person would want stacked in one place. Tank farms to the north, ordnance bunkers cut into the low ridge to the east, a motor pool and maintenance sheds in the belly of the camp, and the cantonment strung along the south fence where men slept and ate and complained. I ran supply. That meant I knew the weight and the count of everything that came through the gate, and I prided myself on it. And I will tell you now that a man can know the count of everything and understand the value of nothing. The wash lines were hers. Down at the southwest corner where the ground fell away toward a dry wash, someone years back had strung wire between posts and set up the field laundry, and by the time I came to Harrow Point the woman worked it alone. Contract labor, not a soldier. She washed the uniforms and the linens and the grease-black shop rags, and she hung them on the wire in long ranked rows so that from a distance the corner of the camp looked like a fleet under sail. She was maybe 40. She had a still face and a way of standing that took up no more room than it had to. She wore her sleeves down even in the anvil heat, and I heard men make sport of that, say she must be hiding something, and I laughed along the way you laugh at a thing you have not thought about. She was up before the bugle and out past dark. In the worst of the summer, when the flats shimmered and men moved from shade to shade like they were fording a river, she was down at the lines with her arms in gray water, and the rows of clean cloth snapped and filled in the wind above her. I passed her every morning on my way to the supply office and every evening on my way back, and for 11 months the whole of our exchange was that I would not look at her and she would not ask me to. If you had told me then that this woman would one day walk 214 men out of a fire with nothing but her voice and the map she carried in her head, I would have laughed at you too. That is the thing about contempt. It is a kind of blindness that feels like knowledge. You think you have taken the measure of a person when all you have done is refuse to look. The word just is a small word and it does a great deal of damage. Just the laundry girl. I must have said it 50 times, and every time I said it I was doing something to her and something to myself, and I understood neither. It was the ordering word for the whole base. There was a hierarchy at Harrow Point as rigid as any I ever served under, and it had nothing to do with rank on paper and everything to do with what a man was thought to be worth. The ops staff sat at the top. Below them the line NCOs, the fuel handlers, the ordnance techs, the mechanics. Below them the cooks and the clerks. And below all of it, so far below that she was off the ledger entirely, was the contract woman at the wash lines. She was not one of us. She was a fixture like the water tower or the fence. You did not thank the fence. I remember the day I put the word on her out loud, because a young private named Dell had done something to earn it. He had spilled a can of chain lube across a stack of clean coveralls, a whole morning's work of hers ruined black, and he'd laughed about it. And the woman had come up from the lines to ask him, quietly, to be more careful because she washed by hand and the solvent ate her skin. And I, who outranked Dell and should have set him straight, I looked at her sleeves rolled down against the sun and I said, "It's fine, she's just the laundry girl, she'll do them again." I said it to make the private feel comfortable. I said it because it was easier than the small hard work of treating her like a person. She looked at me for a moment, not angry, something quieter and worse than angry. Then she gathered the ruined coveralls and carried them back down to the wash and did them again. There was a colonel over us then. I will call him the colonel because in my memory he has stopped being a man and become a lesson. He ran Harrow Point like a ledger, which was a thing I admired in him at the time because I ran supply the same way. Everything on his base had a place and a cost and a use, and he could tell you all three at a glance, and if a thing could not be assigned a use, he did not see it. He walked the camp every morning with his hands behind his back, and his eyes moving over the world like a man taking inventory. And his eyes passed over the wash lines the way mine did, which is to say they registered clean cloth and moved on. She saw everything and no one saw her. That was the arrangement, and I want you to hold it in your mind, because everything that came after turned on it. A person who is invisible learns the whole of a place. She had no meetings to sit in, no reports to write, no station to hold that kept her eyes down. She stood at the low southwest corner of the camp for 11 hours a day with a clear line of sight up the slope to the tank farm and across to the ordnance ridge and down into the motor pool. And while we counted her as nothing, she watched Harrow point the way you watch weather. She knew which way the wind turned at 4 in the afternoon. She knew which fuel line had been weeping at the coupling for a month because she could see the dark stain spreading in the dust below it. She knew all of it. And when she tried to tell us, we heard the laundry girl talking, and we did not hear the words. She came to the supply office first. I should have understood something then, but I did not. It was late in the dry season, and the tank farm had been giving us trouble. One of the older transfer lines, the one that ran down from the number 3 tank along the edge of the motor pool, had developed a seep at a coupling, and the fuel handlers had been meaning to get to it for weeks, and had not, because it was slow, and because the anvil made every job take twice as long, and because there is always something more urgent than the thing that has not caught fire yet. That is the whole grammar of a disaster, that sentence right there. She came up from the lines in the middle of the afternoon, which she almost never did, and she stood in the door of my office with the light behind her, and she said, "Sergeant Ash." It startled me that she knew my name. I did not know hers. She said the seep at the number 3 coupling was worse, that the stain in the dust had doubled in a week and reached the shadow line of the shed, and that the afternoon wind carried the vapor straight down into the motor pool where men ran grinders and cutting torches all day. She said it plainly, in order, like a person reading off a list she had checked twice. I remember being annoyed, not alarmed, annoyed the way you are when the wrong person tells you a true thing. I said the handlers knew about the coupling and it was on the list. She said the list had moved slower than the stain. I told her it was being handled. She looked at me the way she had looked at me over the ruined coveralls, and she said, "The wind turns at 4. The vapor is heavier than air. It will pool in the motor pool bay before it lifts." And God help me, I said, "Thank you, we've got it." In the voice a man uses to end a conversation with someone beneath him, and she stood there one more second, and then she went back down to the lines. I did not tell the handlers. Why would I? She was just the laundry girl. She tried the ops tent next. I heard about it second-hand, and I heard about it as a joke, which is how everything about her traveled. The way the clerks told it, the laundry woman had walked right up to the operations tent during the afternoon brief and asked to speak to the duty officer about the fuel farm, and the duty officer had come out and heard maybe 2 sentences and sent her off, and the clerks laughed because who did she think she was? A woman who washed rags, standing outside the ops tent talking about vapor pooling and wind vectors, and the load rating of the motor pool bay like she had any business knowing those words. It was funny to them precisely because she used the words correctly. That was the part that should have stopped us all cold, and instead was the punch line. She spoke like an engineer, and we heard a laundress putting on airs. I want to be fair to the men, because I was one of them, and I am not writing this to stand above the person I used to be. We were not cruel by intention. We were busy and we were sure, and those 2 things together are as good as cruelty when a warning comes from the wrong mouth. Every one of us had a full day and a clear sense of the order of things, and in that order the woman at the wash lines was a source of clean shirts and nothing else. Information has to travel through a channel a man respects, or it does not travel at all. She had no channel. She had only the truth, and the truth with no standing behind it is just noise to a busy man. She kept watching. I know that now. In the last days before the fire, she was down at the lines longer than ever, and more than once I saw her standing still in the middle of the workday with her eyes up the slope, reading something the rest of us could not see. I thought she was idling. I actually thought that. I thought, there's the laundry girl standing around, and I went back to my count. The thing that finally moved her to force it was the torches. The motor pool had a run of hot work scheduled, cutting and welding on a set of trailer frames, and the schedule put open flame in the lower bay during the afternoon window when the wind turned. She must have seen the work order posted, or seen the torch bottles staged, because on the last morning she did a thing she had never done. She left the lines in the full light of day, with a load half hung on the wire behind her, and she walked up into the middle of the camp to the operations tent, and she went in. I was crossing toward the supply office when it happened, close enough to see all of it, and it is the piece I would give anything to unlive. The colonel was in the tent. She went past the flap and I heard her voice, level as always, saying something about pulling the hot work order for the lower bay, about the coupling, about the wind at 4. And I heard the colonel's voice come back over hers, and then the flap came open and the colonel came out with his hand on her arm, not striking her but moving her, the way you move a thing that is in your way, and he put her out of the tent and past the guy line and into the dirt of the company street. She did not fall. She caught herself and stood. And the colonel said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, loud enough that it was meant to be heard, "You are the laundry. Go back to the laundry." There were maybe a dozen of us in earshot and not one of us said a word. I did not say a word. I stood there with my clipboard and I watched a man put a woman out of a tent for trying to save his base, and the only thing I felt in the moment, the shameful truth of it, was a small mean relief that the awkwardness was over. She smoothed her sleeve where his hand had been. She looked, for just a second, at the men watching at me among them. Then she turned and walked back down toward the wash lines, unhurried, her back straight, and behind her the clean cloth filled and snapped in the first turn of the afternoon wind. The wind that turned at 4, exactly as she'd said it would. I have gone over the timeline of that day more times than I can count, and the plain fact is that everything she warned us about happened, in the order she said it would, within 3 hours of the colonel putting her in the dirt. The hot work in the lower bay ran into the afternoon. The wind came around off the flats at a little after 4 and pushed down the slope from the tank farm, and it carried the vapor from the weeping coupling down into the low ground of the motor pool exactly as she had said heavier than air vapor would, pooling in the bay where the torches were. I was in the supply office with the door open. I did not hear an explosion the way you imagine one, a single great crack. I heard a sound like the whole air being sucked backward, a deep soft whump that I felt in my chest before my ears made sense of it, and then the light in the doorway went wrong, went orange, and a man began to scream in the motor pool. The seep at the coupling had found the flame in the bay, and the flame had run back up the vapor trail to the coupling, and the coupling was at the foot of the tank farm. Do you understand what that means? It means the fire did not stay in the motor pool. It climbed. It went up the transfer line toward the number 3 tank, and toward the whole ranked farm of fuel above us, and it went sideways into the maintenance sheds. And within minutes the northern third of Camp Harrow Point was a wall of fire-throwing heat you could feel through a closed door 200 yards away. And then the power died. The main feeders ran up through the maintenance area, and when the sheds went, the base went dark. Every light, every pump, every fixed thing we relied on. The fire suppression at the tank farm was electric, and it was gone in the first minutes. The camp alarm was electric, and it gave one dying moan and quit. In the space of about 4 minutes, Harrow Point went from a garrison to a trap. A fire eating north to south down the slope. The tank farm cooking off above us and throwing burning fuel in gouts. The ordnance bunkers on the east ridge now sitting in the path of the heat. And 200 and some men in the cantonment on the south end, with the fire between them and every route they knew. I ran out into the company street, and it was chaos of the purest kind. Men pouring out of the barracks half-dressed. NCOs shouting orders that contradicted each other. Someone had opened the main vehicle gate on the east side and men were running for it. And I remember a lieutenant screaming at them to come back because the east gate ran along the foot of the ordnance ridge, and if the bunkers cooked, that road was a killing ground. But there was no plan. That is the thing I need you to feel. We had drills for a fire in the abstract. We had a muster point and a diagram on a wall, but the muster point was in the burning third, and the diagram assumed the power was on and the roots were open. And now, the power was gone and half the roots were fire, and the men who were supposed to know what to do stood in the street and did not know. The colonel was among them. I saw him in the red light and his face had come apart. The ledger had no page for this. Everything on his base had a place and a use, and now his base was burning down in an order he had not authorized and could not stop, and he stood in the middle of the street turning in a slow circle, and no words came out of him. A man who runs a place by control is worth nothing the moment control is gone. I did not think that then. I only saw it. I saw the colonel become, in that light, exactly what he had always taken the woman at the wash lines to be. A person with no use in the moment that mattered. And then, down at the southwest corner, in the one part of the camp the fire had not reached because it sat low and upwind, I saw movement. The laundry girl was walking up out of the wash lines toward the burning base. Toward it. Every other soul in that camp was trying to get away from the fire, and she came up out of the low ground and into the red light walking toward it, and she was not running, and she was not afraid. I do not know how to describe the change in her without it sounding like I am dressing it up after the fact. So I will just tell you what I saw and you can decide. She came up the slope into the light and she stopped at the head of the wash where the ground rose toward the motor pool, and she looked at the fire the way I had seen her look at the empty slope on the ordinary afternoons, that same still reading gaze, except now there was a fire in front of it and the reading was fast. Her eyes went up to the tank farm, along the sheds, down the line of the fire, over to the ordnance ridge back. 2 seconds, maybe 3. And I watched her take the measure of the whole disaster in the time it took the rest of us to panic. Then she turned to the nearest knot of men, and she spoke, and it was the first time I ever heard her raise her voice, and even then she did not shout the way a frightened person shouts. She pitched it to Carrie, flat and hard and absolutely certain, and it cut through the noise because it was the only certain thing in the camp. "Nobody goes east," she said. "The bunkers are in the heat line. That road is dead in 10 minutes. And such was the authority in it that the men who had been running for the east gate stopped and turned and looked at her, and the lieutenant who had been screaming at them fell silent, because here at last was someone who sounded like she knew. She started moving and she started giving orders, and the orders were not guesses. That is what I understood standing there. And it is what changed everything for me in the span of a minute. She was not improvising. She had this. She had walked this base for 11 months building a map in her head of every line and load and route, and she had been trying to give us the map for weeks, and now the disaster had come exactly where she'd said it would, and she simply opened the map and read it to us. She sent a runner to the fuel handlers with an order to throw the manual cutoffs on the number 2 and number 4 transfer lines, not number 3 which was already gone, to starve the fire of the tanks it had not yet reached. She knew where the manual cutoffs were. Half the fuel handlers didn't know there were manual cutoffs. She did because she had found them on her own walks and noted them, the way she noted everything, against a day like this. She turned to me, she knew my name. "Ash," she said, "supply the water on the reefer trucks. The refrigerated trailers run on their own generators, they don't need base power. Get them started, get the men wetting a line across the company street from the mess to the south fence, not to fight the fire, to hold a corridor. Go." And I went. God forgive me for the 11 months, but when she said go, I went. Because for the first time all day someone had said a thing that made sense, and the person who said it was the person I had spent a year refusing to see. I will tell you what she did, because I was in it and I watched it happen, and I still think about how close we came to dying in the dark. The trap was this. The fire had the north. The east gate ran under the ordnance ridge and she had called it dead, and she was right, because the first bunker cooked off maybe 12 minutes in and threw a piece of the ridge across that road. The west side was open ground, but it was open ground under the tank farm, and when a fuel tank lets go it does not burn, it rains. It throws burning fuel out in a circle, and across the west was to cross under that. That left south, the cantonment, where all the men were, and the south fence with one pedestrian gate, and beyond it, 2 miles of open flat to the highway. The whole camp had to funnel through the south, and the fire was working its way down the slope toward that same corner faster than most of us understood. She found the corridor that would hold. There was one lane through the camp that ran from the mess hall down to the south gate along a line of block buildings. The mess and the 2 ablution blocks and the old magazine, all of them masonry. And she saw that if the men moved down that lane, the block buildings would stand between them and the radiant heat coming off the sheds. It was the one route where the fire could not reach across and touch them. She read it off the geometry of the place in the dark, the way a person reads a sentence, and she staked the whole evacuation on it, and she was right. She put the reefer truck water across the head of the lane like a curtain, a wetted line that broke the radiant heat where the lane opened toward the fire, and she posted men to keep it wet, and she stood at the mouth of that corridor herself. She stood where the heat was worst at the top of the lane, and she fed the men down it. That is the picture I will carry to my grave. The woman we called the laundry girl, standing at the hottest point of the whole evacuation with the fire painting her orange, sending men past her down the one lane that would live, counting them as they went. She never left that spot. She held the mouth of the corridor for the better part of an hour, and she walked the entire garrison out through it one group at a time, and she did it without ever once losing the flat certainty in her voice, and she did it in the exact order of a person who had done something like this before. Because she had, but I did not know that yet. In the fire I only knew that she was saving us and that I had spent a year calling her nothing. We got the barracks out first, the men who were only half awake and useless with fear, because she said the panicked ones move worst and you move the worst first while you still have the corridor. We got the mess crew and the clerks. We got the wounded from the motor pool, the men the first blast had caught, carried down the lane on mess tables because she said use the tables. They're long and flat and there are 20 of them. She thought of the tables. In the middle of a burning base, she thought of the tables, because she was the kind of person who had spent 11 months noticing exactly how many tables there were and how long they were, the same noticing we had all mistaken for a woman standing around with nothing to do. The count is the thing that undoes me. I was at the south gate for the last of it, taking the men through, and I was counting, because counting is the one thing I am good for, and I counted them out onto the flat toward the highway. The number that came out of Camp Harrow Point that night was 214. 214 men walked out of that fire, and every one of them walked out down the one corridor she found and held. We lost no one to the fire itself. Every casualty we took was from the first blast, before she came up out of the wash lines. From the moment she started giving orders to the moment the last man cleared the south gate, she did not lose a soul. She was the last through. She held the mouth of the corridor until the count was clear, until the runners came back and told her the barracks were empty, and the motor pool was empty, and there was no one left up the slope, and only then did she come down the lane herself, walking, not running, through the curtain of water and the failing heat, and out the south gate onto the flat where 214 men stood in the dark and the far red light and watched her come. And here is the thing about that walkout. She was burned. Her coveralls were scorched down one side and she had held that furnace mouth for an hour, and as she came through the last of the water the wet cloth pulled at her arm and the sleeve she always wore down, the sleeve men had made their stupid jokes about, tore back. And in the red light I saw her forearm and I saw the old scarring on it, the deep glazed shine of skin that has been through fire before and healed hard, a burn years old and terrible, running from her wrist up under the torn cloth. She had been in a fire before. She carried it on her body. That was what the long sleeves had always covered. Not vanity, not something to hide. A thing that had already happened to her once, that she had already survived once, and had spent 11 months at our wash lines watching for the day it came for us. A colonel from a neighboring post came out with the first response vehicles, an older man, and he saw her, and something crossed his face, and he said her name. Not the laundry girl, her name and a call sign after it. He said, "That's Kiln." And he said it the way you say the name of someone you had thought was dead. They told the story later in pieces, the way these things come out. She had been an officer once, a combat engineer, fire suppression and demolition, the specialty that goes toward the burning thing when everyone else goes away from it. Call sign Kiln, given to her for the fires she'd walked into and out of. Years before, at a fuel depot far from Harrow Point, there had been a fire much like ours, and she had held a corridor much like the one she held for us, and she had walked survivors out through it. 81 men, they said. She'd held that fire open long enough to walk 81 men out. And then she had been broken for it. The fire at the depot had started because of a command decision, a corner cut, a warning ignored, and when the inquiry came, the command that had ignored the warning needed the fault to land somewhere that was not on them, and it landed on her. She had been the officer on the ground. She had disobeyed an order to fall back in order to hold the corridor and save the 81, and saving them was the thing they hung her with, because to admit she'd been right to disobey was to admit the order had been wrong, and the men who gave the order were the men who ran the inquiry. She took the fall. She lost the commission, the call sign, the standing, the channel, everything that would have made a busy man listen to her. So she had come to a place like Harrow Point and taken the only work a broken woman with a ruined record could get, and she had washed our shirts, and she had watched our fuel farm with the eyes of the one person on the base qualified to read it. And when we would not hear the warning she gave in words, she had waited, and she had mapped the way out in the dark of her own head, against the day we would need it. She had saved 81 once and been destroyed for it. And she came up out of the wash lines and did it again for 214 of the men who had called her nothing, and asked us for exactly nothing in return. The colonel, our colonel, the one who had put her in the dirt, was standing in the crowd on the flat when the other officer said her name and her rank and the number 81. I was close enough to watch it land on him. I had watched this man run a base like a ledger, and I had watched him come apart in the street when the ledger failed. And now I watched a third thing happen to his face, which was the thing that has no page in any ledger, the thing a man feels when he understands exactly what he did and exactly to whom. He had put an engineer out of his operations tent by the arm. He had told the one person qualified to save his base to go back to the laundry. He had done it loud in front of his men to make a point about the order of things. And the order of things had just walked 214 of those same men out of a fire that killed no one because she was in it. She came across the flat toward the vehicles, toward the medics who were moving to her now that someone had said her name, and her path took her near where the colonel stood. She was not looking for him. She had never once in any of it looked for a reckoning. She simply had to pass near where he was. He stepped out of the crowd. In front of all of us, the burning base behind him and the 214 around him, he stepped into her path and he stopped, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then the colonel took off his cover. He took the cover off his own head in the field, which a man of his kind does for very few things, and he came to attention, and he saluted her. Held it, a full, correct salute held, to a contract laundress with a torn sleeve and a burned arm, and his hand was not steady when he did it. She looked at him, not with triumph. There was no triumph anywhere in her, not then, not ever that I saw. She looked at him the way she had looked at me over the ruined coveralls a year before, that quiet, worse than angry look that I finally understood was not anger at all but a kind of patience, the patience of a person who has always known her own worth and has simply been waiting, without much hope, for the world to catch up to it. And then, because she had been an officer and the body remembers what the record cannot take away, she straightened and she returned his salute. Correct, unhurried, the way she did everything. And when she did, the whole muster line followed. 214 men on the dark flat, and the salute went down the line like wind through the wash lines, man after man coming to attention, and I came to attention with them, and I put my hand up to a woman whose name I had refused to learn for 11 months, and I held it, and I have never in my life meant anything more. We did not see much of her after. That is the part of the true story that the Count and the salute leave out, and I think it matters, so I will set it down. The response teams took her for her burns. There were inquiries, of course, the way there always are, and this time the inquiries went the other direction, because 214 living men are a hard thing to argue with, and the old ruin of her record came up and got looked at again in a different light. I gave a statement. So did the colonel, and I will say this for him, that his statement did not spare himself in any particular. He wrote down what he had done at the tent, word for word, the shove and the laundry line, and he signed it, and he let it stand in the record next to the count of the men she saved. It was the one useful thing his ledger-keeping was ever good for in the end. He wrote it all down. I do not know if they gave her back the commission. I heard different things. I heard she did not want it. 11 months at a wash line teaches a person something about what the standing is worth, and I think she had made her peace with living outside the channel, having seen what the men inside it were capable of. What I know is that she left Harrow Point, and the wash lines came down, and for a while the southwest corner of the camp looked strange and bare, without the ranked rows of cloth filling in the afternoon wind. I think about the wind a great deal now. The wind that turned at 4, exactly as she said. She had told me about that wind in my own supply office, in order, plainly, and I had said, "Thank you, we've got it," in the voice a man uses to end a conversation with someone beneath him. That voice is the thing I cannot forgive in myself, more than the shove I watched and did not stop, more than the word just, I put on her 50 times. Because the shove was the colonel's and the word was everyone's, but that voice was mine, and in it was the whole of my blindness. She had handed me the way out weeks before we needed it, and I had not been able to hear it because of where it came from. Here is what I learned, and it is the only thing I have worth passing on. A warning is worth exactly what you are willing to hear, and a person is worth exactly what you are willing to see. And if you have decided in advance that a soul is nothing, then that soul can hand you your own life and you will set it down without looking and call it a clean shirt. Her name was on her coveralls the whole time, stitched in thread the color of dust. 214 of us are alive because of the woman who wore it. I read it, finally, on the statement I signed, in plain block letters at the top of the page, and I say it now every time I tell this at the front, where it belongs, because a man ought to name the person who saved him before he tells you anything else. They called her just the laundry girl. She was the only one among us who knew the way out of the fire, and she walked us through it, every one, and never once raised her voice except to say the thing that saved us, "Nobody goes east," and then she stood in the hottest place in the world and counted us home.